Welcome to Back Away Slowly, a series that walks with you through mysterious places, ominous folk tales, strange creatures, and so on, before taking a deeper look at what these stories can tell us about humankind. Episodes are available in a video format on Patreon. The videos include photos, footage of my own visits to these locations, illustrations, animations, and more. Sources, social links, the shop, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewing discretion is advised. An old-timer once said, "God gave Texas oil, and he gave Kentucky Mammoth Cave, but he should have stopped when he finished and not made all those others." You might not realize it if you're just driving through, but the area east of Mammoth Cave is known as the Land of 10,000 Sinks. Pioneers found small caves on their land, and at first they seemed like a liability, particularly when considering livestock. If an animal such as a horse or a cow got too close to a sinkhole opening, it could widen the sinkhole and fall in, maybe snap a leg, or even die. On the other hand, sinkholes could be very useful. Pioneers and future residents recognized this potential, utilizing the caves as storm shelters, as refrigeration for milk, canned goods, and vegetables. Many local children would play in these caves as well. When Prohibition was enforced, moonshiners used the caves to smuggle and hide their whiskey and alcohol. The land itself wasn't easy to farm, as the soil was rocky and often interrupted by hills and gullies. When Mammoth Cave was discovered, many people realized that, quote, there was more money to be made by crawling around under the ground than tilling on top of it. Entire families began to search for and monetize caves, doing anything to attract tourists, which included trying to distract from the popularity of Mammoth Cave. Kentucky cavers became ruthless and competitive, frequently spreading false rumors that Mammoth Cave was flooded, closed, or collapsing. They would then reassure the tourists that they hadn't come all this way for nothing, because their own cave was still open. Quote, in this predominantly Baptist region, shooting and knifing were taboo, but virtually anything else was allowed. Harassment, lying, and tricks of all kinds. Some natives estimated that by 1925, as many as a third of all visitors to the Mammoth Cave area were diverted to the smaller, private caves by nefarious means. Mammoth's managers went to the courts several times to prevent such competitive cave huckstering and to seek injunctions blocking use of the county roads for this purpose. However, these efforts weren't enough. In order to succeed in such an oversaturated market, these groups began to turn on each other. Cavers utilized dirty tricks and threats. Signs to rival caves were torn down or the arrows turned. When confronted, the excuse of heavy winds was given. This back and forth earned this period of time the title the Cave Wars. Despite these conflicts, the community was still very close, and it was into this community that Floyd Collins was born on June 20th, 1887. Now, my resources for this episode mostly utilize two books. One is titled Trapped: The Story of Floyd Collins, which is a very thorough exploration into the facts, emotions, biases, and after effects from the events that we'll discuss. The other was a book written by Floyd's younger brother, Homer Collins. It is from Homer that we get much of our information about young Floyd, as his life was fairly unknown before the major event. Floyd was born in a log cabin, the third child of 8. 15 years older than the youngest child, Homer, Floyd soon took on what Homer described as a fatherly role in Homer's life. Homer trailed after Floyd, into and out of caves that Floyd was so enamored with. But running around underground wasn't all fun and games. Sometimes deadly mistakes were made. In 1897, an entrance into the Great Salts Cave was being dug. A team of workers was being hauled out of a vertical shaft, including a man named Pike Chapman, who was a local caver and was very close to the Collins family. Chapman was struck in the head by a falling rock. Lee Collins, the patriarch of the family, who we'll discuss later, and his eldest son, Jim, heard the cries for help and hurried across the valley. Chapman was carried into Dr. Hazen's house, and 10-year-old Floyd was sent to fetch more assistance, but it was too late. Floyd watched a fellow cave explorer die in that house, surrounded by the men that Floyd looked up to, who weren't able to save him. The shaft became known as Pike Chapman's Entrance, and Floyd never forgot that day. However, he also didn't let the accident scare him away from caving. In fact, years later, Floyd came to work in that same shaft himself. Floyd was commonly considered, quote, not the brightest fella in the world, only completing a 5th grade education. While he had a good deal of experience, his knowledge was also tinged with superstition. Quote, he claimed, for example, that his body enjoyed an innate magnetism that gave him no need for a compass. One day, a friend tested him when Floyd said he was facing north. He wasn't, but his friend did not have the heart to tell him. Once Floyd took a needle from a broken compass and put it in his pocket, carrying it with him thereafter to add to his body magnetism. These superstitions were fairly minor and posed little harm. However, it's important to remember that Floyd wasn't stupid. Despite Floyd loving caves at a level that his mother described as mania, he still planned all of his explorations very carefully. He would converse with older cavers to get advice, he learned to read charts and maps, and he spent hours in caves to gain experience. He collected years and years of practical knowledge, and all of my research echoed that he always told someone what cave he was exploring and when, just in case an emergency was to arise. Unfortunately, some members of the family didn't understand or respect Floyd's passion. His father, Lee, thought that caving was a waste of time, at least until Floyd discovered Crystal Cave on the family proper in 1917, which they turned into a tourist attraction. Floyd and his father weren't close, but they usually managed to maintain a tentative peace. Floyd built a ticket office in 1921, and Homer began a taxi service around the Mammoth Cave Hotel in order to drive tourists to Crystal Cave. Others began to take note of Crystal Cave's success, and soon the brothers had to contend with the cave war antics of jealous nearby properties. At first, it was fairly minor, if not obnoxious. Someone began telling travelers that Crystal Cave was closed. Homer reports, quote, sometimes our road was blocked by wagons left there accidentally by a forgetful farmer. The road was narrow, and it was impossible to drive around the wagons. At other times, there were boulders on the road, or big holes appeared overnight. When they weren't scared off, things began to escalate. On one Saturday in 1924, Homer was visiting a girlfriend in Bonneville, and Floyd had gone across the river to see a friend, when someone burned down their barn and rooming house. Things reached a peak that winter. While Homer was at a mill getting lumber, 5 men threatened Floyd to sell the cave. When Floyd refused, one of the men pulled out a gun. When Floyd still refused, the beating began. At that moment, Homer's wagon crested the hill. Taking in the situation, Homer leapt off the wagon and ran for the back of the house, grabbing his revolver. The men piled into the car, but Homer wasn't done with them. Homer pursued on foot, firing. As it was winter and the road was bad, the group was forced to drive relatively slowly, so a few of Homer's shots hit their mark. I'm unsure if this means that his bullets hit the car or if they hit flesh. I can only assume that the phrase hit their mark was carefully chosen. Floyd and Homer later filed charges against the gang, but their complaints went ignored. Floyd was determined not to be chased out by violence, so the brothers prepared for any future encounters. Now, this whole situation may sound crazy to modern-day listeners, but remember that this was an area that was very remote. Education was sparse, and options for making a living were slim. Caves were looked at as part of their home and childhood, making many families as defensive of the caves as they would be for their own house. And for Floyd, caving was the only calling he'd ever had. Homer loved and admired his brother and wanted to support him, so there they stayed. Floyd struck a deal with neighbor Beasley Doyle to explore Sand Cave, which was on Doyle's property. Not long after Floyd began to explore the cave, Homer recalls that, quote, one night he dreamed that he was trapped in a cave and could not get out. The dream was so vivid that he woke up sweating and struggling in his bed, and he was unable to go back to sleep that night. Such a dream might seem natural considering the hazardous conditions in Sand Cave, but it was unusual for Floyd. On hearing about the dream, our stepmother, whom Pap had married after Mother's death, said that she had been feeling all along that something bad was going to happen to him. But Floyd was accustomed to such warnings, and he scoffed at the incident and continued with his work. Sunday, January 25, 1925, Homer was going up to Louisville to get a car, but walked with Floyd to a neighbor's home beforehand. Floyd asked, "I'm going to open a big cave any day now. Won't you stay and help me?" The next paragraph was one of the heaviest in Homer's book. Quote, "Looking back upon that moment now, I would have given anything in the world to relive it so I could answer yes. But I was young, and buying a car seemed more important to me. A trip to Louisville was much more inviting than a grimy crawl into that dark, gloomy hole beneath the bluff. Furthermore, I had the greatest faith in Floyd's ability. There was no doubt in my mind that he could finish the job alone. I decided not to stay and help him." Floyd believed that Sand Cave was connected to Mammoth Cave, and he was going to break through any day now. He was right, the two cave systems are connected, but he would never confirm this. On Friday morning, January 30th, 1925, Floyd told Doyle that this was the day he would break through. Floyd entered the cave with a kerosene lantern. A tight spot forced him onto his stomach, one arm stretched in front to push the lantern through. The cave began to open up after this, but the lantern flickered. Floyd decided it would be best to turn back, instead of possibly losing his light. But as he turned in the tight spot, his foot dislodged a rock that trapped his ankle. The next morning, Doyle saw that Floyd's bed hadn't been slept in, so he hurried to neighbor Ed Estes' house. But Floyd wasn't there either. In the search, Estes' 17-year-old son Jewel Estes found Floyd's coat hanging outside of the cave, his hat on a nearby ledge. Jewel entered the cave, managing to crawl in close enough to talk to Floyd. Floyd told Jewel to fetch Floyd's friend and fellow caver Johnny Gerald, as well as Homer and their other brother Marshall. When news reached the Collins household, Old Man Lee wasn't interested in going. He was 65 years old, he had just recovered from the flu, and he had just retrieved his youngest daughter Nellie, who had a long history of mental illness and had been at an asylum for 6 months. However, Marshall immediately hopped onto a mule to follow Doyle and Estes to the cave. By the time he arrived, many representatives of local families, black and white, had gathered at the cave entrance. Marshall assembled a party of 5 to join him into the cave, but it was so tight and terrifying that only African-American Mammoth Cave guide Lewis Brown stayed with Marshall to reach Floyd. Meanwhile, Homer stopped at a gas station on the way home from Louisville. A young boy asked him, "Have you got your brother out of the cave yet?" Heart in his throat, Homer leapt into his car, thinking over and over again, quote, "If only I had stayed to help him when he asked me." Homer approached a cluster of bonfires that had been lit around the cave entrance. He passed them all, asking if they'd freed his brother. When they said no, he grabbed a torch and walked to the cave mouth. Someone called to him that he'd ruined his clothes and he should change. Without turning or slowing down, Homer responded, "Clothes don't make no difference. That's my brother down there." Homer reached Floyd, who explained how he got into this mess. After that story, he fed Floyd 9 sausage sandwiches and a pint bottle of coffee. Homer also covered Floyd's head in burlap sacks to deflect water that had been chilling Floyd's face, as it had trickled down from the snow that had been melted by bonfires on the surface. Homer then worked and dug for 8 hours to try to free Floyd, to the point that his fingers were skinned and his body shook. Floyd gently encouraged his little brother to leave and rest, to find Johnny Gerald, and to please bring him some whiskey, specifying to get the good stuff, no moonshine. Homer and Oscar Logston drove to nearby Cave City to get half a pint of whiskey and some rock candy to mix it with. By the time they returned, an enormous crowd had gathered, with cars bumper to bumper. Deputy Sheriff Turner saw Oscar holding the whiskey and seized it, though notably he didn't confiscate any of the alcohol that many in the crowd were drinking. Homer tried to organize several rescue parties, but all of these efforts were met with indifference. He convinced a group of local boys to take Floyd some food, but when they returned, quote, telling tales of how they held the trapped man's head, fed him, and comforted him, Homer knew that they were lying. He re-entered the cave himself and confirmed that no one had fed Floyd all day. Homer tried a crowbar. He used a syrup bucket to remove rocks from around Floyd, uncovering his hands that were coated in blood and dirt from desperate digging. When Homer emerged 4 hours later, Marshall asked what could be done, but both brothers were near hysteria. Lee Collins chose that moment to unhelpfully contribute that maybe Floyd being trapped was God's will. As you can imagine, a fight broke out, Homer raging that their father didn't care if Floyd lived or died. Marshall turned to the crowd, desperately offering $500 to anyone who could free Floyd. This was the equivalent of just over $8,700 today. But the crowd, who had so eagerly watched the drama, balked. Except for a man named Clyde Hester. So Hester went into the cave. But when Hester came back, he claimed that Floyd was dead. In the ensuing desperate scramble, a 21-year-old L.B. Hooper made it to Floyd, who was still alive, and confused, as he hadn't even seen Hester. By the time a furious Hooper came out of the cave, Hester was long gone. And so began a vicious cycle. An individual would try to take Floyd food, but then they would hide the food in alcoves in the cave to avoid going in further. There was plenty of arguing, but no leadership. Frankly, it seems like many tried to insert themselves into the situation for attention, accolades, and/or bragging rights. Quote, "There was something truly fearful about Sand Cave that had brought out the worst in men, and for the past 2 days, cowardice had clearly outstripped bravery." When it came to the family, Old Man Lee was less concerned about the rescue and more troubled by the drinking and swearing being done by bystanders, claiming it offended his Baptist soul. Marshall was falling to illness, undoubtedly triggered by stress. Homer's fire still burned bright, and he fueled it with the repeatedly supported conclusion that he couldn't rely on anyone else. Homer entered the cave again, and, as he dug, Floyd began to hallucinate white chariots pulled by white horses and ridden by angels. He babbled on about trays of chicken sandwiches, liver, onions, and milk. Homer tried to ignore these ramblings, but eventually he sat and rested his hand on the shoulder of his poor, tormented, hallucinating brother. And that was how they stayed for the rest of that cold, wet night. On Sunday, Homer again crept closer to hysteria. He raged at bystanders crowding the cave entrance, but they ignored him. To his dismay, reporters began to show up to pester rescuers. Homer had no way of knowing that all of this was just the beginning. False information and lies of heroism followed soon after the reporters showed up at the cave. For example, A.W. Nichols of the Evening Post arrived in a suit, overcoat, brimmed hat, and striped tie, every inch the city newspaperman. He later claimed that he made it within 10 feet of Floyd to shout words of encouragement. But other reporters on scene said that he hadn't even approached the cave entrance. Late Sunday night, a 21-year-old reporter from the Courier-Journal in Louisville arrived at the cave. William B. Miller was mostly known by the nickname Skeets, as he was, quote, no bigger than a mosquito. Skeets arrived right as Homer was leaving the cave, and Skeets asked him if they had gotten Floyd out. After 8.5 hours of work, Homer only saw another pesky newspaperman. Homer snapped at him that he could go in and find out for himself. Much to Homer's surprise, Skeets marched over to the cave and entered. Unlike all of those who abandoned the trip partway in, Skeets made it all the way to Floyd and interviewed him for 10 minutes. Skeets had no idea at the time, but that interview would win him the Pulitzer Prize. But in that February of 1925, Skeets emerged covered in mud 75 minutes after he went in, and sank to his knees in the sludge, sobbing. He had entered for an interview, but those 75 minutes had changed his entire life. Paper forgotten, he dedicated all of his efforts to the rescue. On February 2nd, Louisville fireman Lieutenant Robert Burden arrived. When bystanders bombarded him with information, he thought, quote, if half of what they say is true, the entombed man's ears must be ringing and his stomach bloated. Burden also noted that alcohol was on the breath of many. In the cave, Burden's suspicions were confirmed when he saw all of the milk bottles and food stashed around. When he reached Floyd, Floyd confirmed that only Homer and 2 others had successfully reached him. After Burden made his way out, many plans arose, but one tore the group down the middle, pulling Floyd out. Many natives remembered pulling to be deadly in the past with other cavers. Though Floyd was willing to take the risk of parting with his foot, 2 doctors contributed that he might bleed out before reaching the surface, or worse, that his shoulders, chest, or internal organs might tear first. The argument reached a fever pitch when Burden shouted at the locals, quote, "That boy is gonna die for sure in that goddamn hole unless we drag him out." This, combined with the desperation of the family, seemed to crumble their resolve. They acquiesced that they would at least have to try. As a side note, now about 200 people had gathered outside the cave to watch the drama unfold. By this point, 2 tents had been erected, one to sell hot coffee and snacks to bystanders, and one to sell first aid supplies. Tuesday morning, Homer found a harness in Cave City, and Homer, Skeets, Burden, and 5 others entered the cave to hook up Floyd. However, pulling caused excruciating agony that drove Floyd to delirium. The others left while Homer stayed behind to soothe his brother. As the majority of the team were leaving, Burden and Skeet's flashlights failed, causing them to panic. After collectively fumbling their way out, the entire rescue party collapsed at the cave entrance. Marshall and Homer were put into the care of a physician. Homer tearfully offered another $500 to any doctor who could amputate Floyd's leg, but no one accepted. Marshall would be incapacitated for 3 days, but Homer could not be kept from the cave. He hitched a ride back to the rescue site, but Burden stopped him from entering, believing him to be too emotional. Meanwhile, Skeets and several volunteers were rigging up an electrical cord to a 32-volt generator so that Floyd would have light and warmth. Years later, Homer would write, quote, "From all over the country came a continuous influx of so-called experts, well-intentioned men who were good in their fields but had no knowledge of caves. Hard feelings developed between Geralds and some of these outsiders. Factions began to develop, and some harsh words were passed among the opposing groups. There were reports of threats among the rescue workers. Tension was high." Floyd's childhood friend and fellow caver Johnny Gerald in particular tried to restrict access to the cave from outsiders, frequently referred to as outlanders. Quote, "He wanted only those to go in who knew something about central Kentucky caves and their peculiarities. According to his view, rescue crews were to be selected for their caving knowledge and be few in number. The more persons who were allowed to go in and out, the more likely that walls and ceiling would collapse. He was also concerned that so many people stomping around might trigger a rockfall in the cave." Gerald and a small crew entered the cave. Floyd immediately reacted to Gerald's voice calling, "Is that you, Johnny?" Johnny answered, "You betcha, I came to get you out." "That's Johnny Gerald, he's my friend. Let him down here." Gerald worked around Floyd for 2.5 hours, but progress was made. By the time he left, Floyd had space to move his upper right leg and he had space around his chest. Gerald also rolled up a blanket under Floyd's head to allow him to sleep. When Gerald emerged from the cave, he told the rescue team his plan to dig over Floyd, but he also said, "Keep those damn drunks out of the cave." Gerald was right to be concerned. The commotion above had melted even more snow, which then trickled into the cave and ground. This caused the passage to become muddier, the walls weaker. Despite Homer and Gerald's best efforts to keep outsiders away, Homer later wrote, quote, "A small city had sprung up around the cave. The moonshiners were in their glory. Floyd was trapped on Friday. By Monday, the area began to take the atmosphere of a carnival, with much drinking, cussing, and fighting in the area around the cave. Irresponsible people went into the tunnel with great fanfare, stayed for a short while just out of sight, and then returned with wild tales of conditions inside the cave. The food they were to carry to Floyd was later found on ledges all along the passage. The air was filled with rumors. Someone said that there was no one trapped in the cave at all, that the whole thing was just a publicity stunt." Wild reports were soon published, almost all of them greatly exaggerating the facts or just straight up lying. A few of these headlines included "Kentuckian trapped alive by 7-ton boulder" and "Man underground 80 hours, still lives." The stories then being printed in cities like Chicago, Washington, or New York. Some of the wild claims from these stories included Floyd's feet were swollen to twice their size. Only a boy named Estes had been able to feed Floyd. Over 500 people were at the site. That Homer had tried to squeeze through the 18 by 12-inch tunnel, but had to be rescued, quote, after several large pieces of skin had been torn from his body by the jagged rocks. The Louisville Herald in particular had printed in the Sunday paper that Floyd was free. But then in the Monday edition, they said that Floyd was separated from rescuers by more than 8 feet of solid rock. On February 2nd, the Nashville Tennessean ran a Monday article that claimed that Floyd was begging for a knife to cut off his own foot. Smaller inaccuracies included Floyd's age being reported as 21, 28, or 35. That Homer was 22, 28, or 30. Also that Floyd's own lantern exploding had caused the cave-in. A far cry from his first impressions, Homer now appreciated Skeet Miller's presence, as he had proved to be reliable and helpful in sticking to the facts and dismissing harmful rumors. Those who grew up with the animated film Balto might recognize a familiar story, as on Tuesday, February the 3rd, the diphtheria outbreak in Nome, Alaska, and the race for the cure, including Alaskan Malamute Balto, had pushed Floyd's story aside in some papers. However, other papers resolutely held on to Floyd's plight, determined to make the rescue not just a local affair, but a national rescue. Back at that national rescue, while Johnny Gerald was resting, Lieutenant Burden used the opportunity to hastily construct a rig involving a fire hose in an attempt to pull Floyd out, with or without his foot. Other locals weren't about to let this slide, and the ensuing ruckus woke Gerald, who then joined the fight. Burden defended his aggressive efforts with words and descriptions about Floyd's potential fate that were so harsh that it reduced Old Man Lee to tears. Burden was finally forced to abandon his plan, only having succeeded in building the wall between outsiders and locals even higher. On Tuesday afternoon, a superintendent and licensed civil engineer of Kentucky Rock Asphalt Company named Henry Carmichael arrived. He spent this first bit of time reading the social situation, gathering information, and organizing an operation to focus on the efficiency of working teams. All of that done, he began to scout for the best location to build a rescue shaft. However, when they found the best location and 7 Kyrock drillers assembled to start, a wave of locals rose up to stop them. Taking the lead, Homer stepped forward to explain that drilling a shaft would likely collapse the tunnel and kill Floyd. Listening to the concerns of the locals, Carmichael agreed to halt the drilling plan and focus on the existing passageway. At 5:30 p.m., Skeets entered the tunnel while dragging the light cord for Floyd, soon followed by a team with Burden. Skeets and Burden were hopeful, as an impressive amount of rubble had been moved. Skeets fed Floyd before working to free his leg. As Floyd drank milk from a straw, Miller read to him from a stack of telegrams that had been sent from all over the country, offering prayers and words of encouragement. Skeet's next descent included what would be the largest team of the operation, numbering 11. They attempted to use various jacks, but all of them were too big. Skeets and the team worked to make an impromptu jack using crowbars. All of these efforts failed, but Skeets kept working until he began to cry in frustration. Floyd gently encouraged Skeets to go back above ground and rest. This was a good call, as Skeets collapsed in the upper tunnels and had to be pulled out by Burden. Johnny Gerald returned to the site and approved of Skeets' efforts, but again voiced concern at how many people were entering the cave. A Louisville builder named Samuel Matlack stepped forward. He wanted to use a special blowtorch to burn away the limestone directly over Floyd's head. Gerald cited a few problems with this plan. 1. Matlack himself was too big to get through the tunnels to Floyd anyway. 2. The rock would be heated to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, which would kill Floyd in such a tight chamber. 3. Even putting that aside, the heat would almost certainly collapse the tunnel. They concluded the discussion with the surely obvious verdict, no blowtorch. Skeets and Burden were taken to Cave City to recover. In their wake, chauvinism, pride, and animosity began to corrupt what had begun as good intentions. Before this nasty mix could reach disastrous consequences, 300 troops of the National Guard arrived. Note that the number of troops changes per source, especially since different groups came at various times. The effect was near instantaneous. Quote, "The rowdiness at the cave disappeared. Pickpockets were forced to abandon their trade. The moonshiners rapidly cleared out, and the drinking stopped." These guardsmen also began to enforce who was coming in close proximity of the cave. Outsiders coming in to enforce access definitely raised tension with the locals, but it undeniably provided some much-needed order to the rowdy, drunken chaos posed by less responsible natives and visitors. Like Gerald, Carmichael was concerned with reports of the cave's status, so he asked Gerald and Casey Jones to go assess the situation. At 2:30 a.m., both entered the cave. Rocks in the ceiling were very loose, the ceilings bulging dramatically. The bridge was so close to the floor that Jones had to wriggle past. Gerald started to suffer from nausea and was near fainting, so he had to stay in the passageway. But as Jones was talking to Floyd, Gerald began to hear the earth settling above him. He called out desperately for Jones to return. Meanwhile, Floyd, unaware of the dangerous development in the cave, was receiving some coffee from Jones and conversing with him, desperate for company. But Jones heard Gerald's cries, quote, "For God's sake, Jones, come on, come out, you'll get us killed." I'm unsure if it was the sound of his friend sounding so scared, or if Floyd just couldn't stand being alone anymore. But this reduced Floyd to hysterics. As Jones hurriedly left, Floyd called out, "Get a doctor. For the love of God, get a doctor and have him come in here and cut off my leg." But Jones had no time to hesitate, as he almost became trapped himself. He was just barely in time to slip under the 10-foot portion of ceiling as it crept closer and closer to the floor. The last thing that Jones heard of Floyd was the trapped man begging Jones to stay, but, nauseous with grief and guilt, Jones escaped. By 4 a.m., it had been 4.5 days of being trapped. Jones and Gerald finally emerged. After hearing news of the cave-in, Miller refused to accept that Floyd may be dead, insisting on going in. Carmichael began to stop him, but Homer appeared, also demanding to go in with Miller. However, by this point, Homer was incredibly weak and ill-looking, so Maddox volunteered to go instead. Miller and Maddox found the passageway to now be only 18 inches high and 2 feet wide. They estimated the cave-in itself to be 4 feet thick and approximately 12 to 14 feet from Floyd. But they could still hear Floyd. And what was better, Floyd said he was free. Skeets didn't tell Floyd of the severity of the cave-in, wanting to keep him calm. He called out to Floyd that if he was thirsty, there was still a half-full bottle of milk over his head. Skeets asked Floyd if he could reach the bottle, but Floyd said no. Quote, Miller dropped his head on his arm. Evidently, Floyd had been afraid that unless he said something sensational, they would leave him. At last, the newsman said evenly, "You're not free, are you, Floyd?" "Nah, I'm not free." Even as Miller left the cave, he begged to go back in with a field telephone. The book Trapped, the story of Floyd Collins, takes on a frustrated tone in its writing at this point, as the author questions why this hadn't been done in the 4 days beforehand. Indeed, they also could have rigged up a feeding tube as well. But now it was too little, too late. At 11:30 a.m., Miller re-entered and rigged up the field telephone as deep as possible and called out encouragement to Floyd. As he left, a slurry of rocks and mud fell on his legs. Skeets managed to escape, but the scare shook him up badly. Despite this, when Skeets emerged at 12:15, he told waiting reporters that he still believed this rescue was possible. At 4 p.m., Burden entered the cave and made it within an estimated 40 feet of Floyd. He claimed that he could hear Floyd screaming and praying wildly, that Floyd's mind had completely snapped. When Burden emerged, he told Carmichael that the passage was now too dangerous and that even a shaft wouldn't save Floyd. Burden's time of leading this rescue was over. 5 p.m., Gerald investigated the cave-in and was encouraged when he found that the dirt wasn't tightly packed in. Floyd heard Gerald and began to cry out to him, begging and pleading. Incapable of doing anything further at that time, and unable to stand the sound of his sobbing friend, Gerald left. This entire time, Carmichael had been quietly observing all of the players in this game. He admired Miller for his courage, but he had no caving experience. Carmichael found Lieutenant Burden to be sincere, but erratic and hot-tempered. He concluded that Gerald made the most sense as a rescuer. Now, Gerald didn't love Carmichael, but he needed his expertise in reinforcing the walls. Gerald emphasized that this was now a race against time, and so began 4 hours of Gerald and the Kyrock team working through the cave-in. Matlack, the man who suggested they should unleash a flamethrower in Floyd's cavern, apparently couldn't take no for an answer. He and George Morrison, who was the owner of the new entrance of Mammoth Cave, snuck into the first passageway, but they were discovered and escorted out of the cave. Gerald and Maddox re-entered the cave at 8 p.m. using chisels and a grease gun. They planned to squeeze past the collapse and use the Vaseline to slide Floyd's foot free. They managed to clear an opening, but then found that any jostling of the walls at all was too dangerous. Through the opening came Floyd's voice. "Get me out, Johnny, old pal. For God's sake, get me out, and you and Oscar Logston take me back to Cave City. My God, Johnny, we were boys together. You can't fail me now." They had to retreat, but Gerald re-entered the cave at 10:30 p.m. to find a new cave-in. He tried to dig, but was stopped when a rock struck him in the head. When he called out to Floyd, Floyd responded, quote, "Don't bother me. I've gone home to bed and I'm going to sleep." Gerald was still determined to continue, but a 40-pound rock fell on his spine. When he recovered from the shock, the terror and pain of that moment convinced him that his nerve had been broken, and he knew that he had to leave. 11:45 p.m., Wednesday night, February the 4th. Homer, Lee, Lieutenant Burden, Skeets Miller, and Johnny Gerald stood silently staring into the gloom of the cave. They were all struggling to acknowledge that, despite their best efforts and near-relentless determination, that they weren't enough. Homer rushed the cave, self-preservation long gone, but he was restrained. Lee begged his son not to be foolish, unhelpfully restating that maybe all of this was simply the Lord's will. Even Gerald admitted that to continue as they were would be suicide. The last words that were heard from Floyd at this stage were, quote, "You're too slow. Too slow." Outside professionals swooped in, all convinced that Floyd's rescue was no longer a caving problem, but an engineering issue. On Thursday the 5th, Lieutenant Governor Henry H. Denhart arrived to lead the shaft operation. Homer tried to argue with him about the dangers of drilling into the hillside, but Denhart simply ordered that Homer be escorted away. Although it appeared that Homer had been ignored, the drilling crew quickly eliminated power shovels, dynamite, and pneumatic drills as options, determining that they would all have a high risk of hurting Collins. This reduced their toolbox down to only picks and shovels. Late afternoon on Friday, February the 6th, over 75 men went to work. The amount of attention that had been drawn to this rescue meant that hoisting derricks, railroad ties, drum drills, wheelbarrows, pickaxes, 6-mile teams, 2 Fordson tractors, and a Delco lighting system were at their disposal. Quote, Carmichael predicted that it would take 30 hours to reach Floyd's level. That meant a digging rate of 2 feet an hour. However, it became quickly evident that only 3 people could work in the shaft at a time. By 7 p.m., only 7 feet had been dug, making the digging rate at a grim 1 foot per hour. During all of this, Lieutenant Burden had been sulking about being excluded from the operation by Gerald, and that his pulling rig had been thwarted by Homer. With new people in charge, Burden saw an opportunity to inject himself into the operation once more. On Friday morning, Burden positioned a small steam engine at the mouth of the cave, planning to use a 75-foot hose to pump hot air down to the freezing Floyd. Burden went inside to examine the cave-in, and came back out claiming that Gerald had lied about the second cave-in as, quote, it looked just like the first. Gerald exploded at Burden, condemning his reckless plan to heat the cave as just another example of outsiders' ignorance. Quote, "Scientists later confirmed what Gerald already knew, that the hot air pumped into the cave dissipated into the surrounding rock and soil as soon as it was released, making the heated area more susceptible to collapse." By February 6th, 400 automobiles were jamming the roads to Sand Cave. Reporters harassed locals for information about the rescue. Tempers got so hot that Gerald and Homer were banned from the site. But at this point, I think we all know that nothing was going to stop Homer. By mid-afternoon, Homer snuck into the cave. No one knows how long he was down there at the cave-in, calling out to his brother. On his way out, Homer was found by 2 National Guardsmen who said, "Don't you know you can be court-martialed for this?" An emotionally frayed Homer responded, "I don't give a damn about you and your martial law. My brother is down there dying, and I was trying to help him." But by the time Homer emerged from the cave, he was sobbing, declaring that he feared that Floyd was dead. Another of Homer's brothers, Andy Lee, collapsed at the sight of the desperate, weeping Homer covered in mud. Just before this, Gerald and Carmichael were attempting to convince Denhart to let them analyze the cave-in. Eventually, Carmichael had enough of Gerald's abrasive statements towards the man that they were trying to convince. Carmichael rounded on Gerald, saying that, quote, "They had done all that was possible through the old passageway, and that if Floyd was to be saved, it would be as a result of the engineering knowledge of men like himself, and not the hit-or-miss work of the natives." It was into this argument that Homer stumbled. Denhart was furious, as he had been prepping another rescue team, functioning under the belief that they had another rescue on their hands. Before Denhart banned Homer from the site, Homer managed to tell Gerald that the cave-in wasn't as severe as they had believed. The rocks could easily be moved, but if they started blasting or drilling, it would collapse. Gerald said, quote, "I knew the hole wasn't closed up. I don't care who said it, even if Denhart did himself." Unfortunately, Denhart overheard him, and this seemed to be the last straw. He grabbed Gerald's arm and said, quote, "Get out of here, and don't come back." After banishing Gerald and Homer, Denhart stationed several plainclothed civilians amongst the bystanders to report on the mood of the crowd. Tensions had already been high, and with the number of spectators and aggressive reporters increasing, he feared the possibility of a riot. Denhart also requested more guardsmen, who were now armed with 800 rounds of ammunition. His concerns were a little justified. Up on a hill overlooking the rescue, Homer and Gerald raged at the military in the operation. A few local hotheads began to toy with the idea of using their squirrel rifles to chase off the state authorities and other outsiders. While all of this tension stewed on the hill, a heavier electrical cord was used to replace Miller's shop cord that went to the light on Floyd's chest. S.H. Lane, who was in charge of the rescue lighting, connected an amplifier to the wires so that movement from Collins would be picked up as sound. Quote, "To encourage Floyd to move around, Lane alternatively switched the light on and off. After listening closely, he claimed that Floyd's bulb had loosened in its socket, and his movements were now alternatively closing and opening the contact. After reproducing this condition with another bulb on the surface and comparing the noises, Lane flatly declared that Floyd was still alive." Several doctors at the site also reasoned that Floyd could be alive, especially if he could maneuver his mouth to catch dripping groundwater. Meanwhile, the rescue site was becoming more and more chaotic. Quote, "Trucks and vans appeared and dumped machinery of all shapes and descriptions onto the hillsides. Who ordered it and what it was for was a matter for conjecture. Wire, cables, sledgehammers, picks, logs, blankets, coffee pots, and a host of the items, both large and small, were unloaded and left lying about. The Louisville Gas and Electric Company sent so much equipment that it required 5 trucks to haul in. By Friday night, the rescue site looked like one huge, chaotic salvage yard. Although a testimony to the concern of the public and its desire to help, much of this material was unusable or inapplicable to the Sand Cave situation. When I visited, the roads to Sand Cave weren't exactly wide. This is admittedly almost 100 years later, and the area almost certainly looks different. But 400 automobiles didn't have a place on the modern-day roads, let alone multiple deliveries of crates, tools, and machinery. This would have made it increasingly difficult for prevalent items and people to make it to Sand Cave. However, one benefit of national concern was that the Collins family was no longer solely responsible for the cost of the rescue operations. Sam Caldwell of the People's Bank began to solicit funds. The National Red Cross stepped in to assist with feeding the rescue workers, who had previously been living off of, quote, black coffee, crackers, and moonshine whiskey. You can't get more Kentucky than that. In spite of all this mayhem, by Friday late afternoon, the crowd of 500 thinned until only friends and family of Floyd watched over the operation. Old Man Lee, Miss Jane, and Nellie left at 8 p.m. Marshall stayed until midnight, and Homer slept on a cot in the hospital tent. Speaking of the Collins family, they all reacted to the situation in a variety of ways. Old Man Lee was unsteady and weak, his limp growing more pronounced and his hands shaking endlessly. More concerningly, he seemed to be teetering on a break with reality. Quote, he disclosed to reporters that he had received a proposal from a Chicago booking agent offering Floyd a salary of $350 a week for a vaudeville tour. He wandered around, proclaiming that God's will led Floyd into the cave and that God's will would lead him back out. He consistently refused medication or rest, determined to stay at the rescue site. He would cry and murmur to himself, quote, I reckon God wants me and my boy. Well, I'm ready, but I fear Floyd is not. All of these desperate hopes and pleas failing to yield tangible results, he finally rationalized on Friday that Floyd had been saved either way. He would either be rescued, or God would lift Floyd to his mother in heaven. Miss Jane was Floyd's 65-year-old stepmother who suffered from asthma and heart trouble. She first arrived at the mouth of the cave with Homer's help, but collapsed. She spent the rest of the rescue present, but at a distance with her daughter Nellie. Nellie was Floyd's younger sister. She had a history of mental illness, and it was she whom Old Man Lee had retrieved from a sanatorium earlier. Despite these struggles, she remained at the rescue site, watching over the proceedings and her stepmother. Andy Lee, as previously mentioned, was another brother. He, his wife, and their 3 children had driven madly to the cave from Kewanee, Illinois, being part of 2 car accidents on the way. He fainted at the cave mouth, though some observers claimed that liquor was the real culprit. This would certainly explain the 2 car accidents. Before he could be taken to Cave City, he shouted claims and accusations, primarily blaming Gerald or Lee for the situation. Homer was very unpredictable, chafing loudly against Denhart's ban. He also disagreed with attacks against his father, but he also distanced himself from Old Man Lee. He clearly didn't want further harm to come to his family, but Homer aggressively rejected Old Man Lee's statements that Floyd's plight was God's will. More than anything, he didn't seem to know how to handle or help his father, and honestly, he didn't have the time, energy, or attention to spare. On Saturday, February the 7th, the National Guard erected 5-strand barbed wire fences wrapped from tree to tree around the rescue site. This stirred the locals' anger even further, to the point that Denhart and Carmichael knew that they had to do something to ward off a riot. They decided to inform the locals of the blinks of the light bulb, proving that Floyd lived. Carmichael also approved the use of a diamond drill to burrow with a set of microphones in an attempt to pick up Floyd's heartbeat. For 2 hours, everyone but crying babies were silent as they listened. 1 or 2 people laughed, and were immediately asked to leave. The conclusion of this test was that they couldn't detect Floyd, but they could tell that the shaft would come within 10 feet of him. Naturally, the locals were only informed of the latter fact. Unwilling to sit around and wait, but unable to enter the site, Homer searched for another cave that might connect to Sand Cave. He found a sinkhole 200 yards from the entrance to Sand Cave, and I can almost retroactively feel Homer's heart skip a beat as he found 2 unburned matches that were the same kind that Floyd used. After further investigation, Homer's hope was crushed when he found that the cave led away from Sand Cave. Outside of the immediate rescue area, the over 400 automobiles full of sightseers were wreaking havoc. Nearby farmers found their corn rib eaten by visiting horses, pumps torn up by interlopers, and fields crushed underfoot. In town, a crime wave of pickpockets and thieves skyrocketed, forcing Magistrate Turner to deputize 25 residents with white ribbons that read police. About 120 cars on average would come to and leave the area per hour. Warmer weather encouraged more and more people to wander to the site for the sake of curiosity and entertainment. All of this new activity finally built into the most well-known day of this rescue event, Carnival Sunday. An estimated total of 10,000 people descended on the site. 4,500 automobiles coming in and out of the area, bearing license plates of 20 different states. By 11 a.m. on February 8th, there were 2 lines of cars on the road from Cave City, 3 miles of fender-to-fender traffic. This caused supplies meant for rescue workers to be delayed for hours. Nearby farmyards and open fields were casually commandeered and crushed to be used as parking lots. The book Trapped, the Story of Floyd Collins describes the scene best. Quote, "It was like a county fair, with a religious revival thrown in. Women in poke bonnets were there, sitting astride long-eared mules. Bewhiskered men wearing Confederate slouch hats and even coonskin caps stood or walked beside them. Families arrived in flivvers, meaning a cheap car, clutching supplies of corn pone, which is similar to cornbread. Children spilled out and raced away as frantic mothers called for them to come back. City folk gingerly stepped through the mud and mire, hoping to salvage their shoes, and finally abandoning the struggle. Young girls on the arms of their beaux coquettishly allowed themselves to be helped over the fences and across the ruts. Here and there a flapper appeared, attracting the eye of attached and unattached males alike. Frisky adolescents razzed each other and stole one another's hats, throwing them into the air. Mothers carried small babies in their arms and nursed them with breasts modestly hidden by shawls. At the dry spots on the hillside, men, women, and children sat in family groups and ate the contents of picnic baskets. Businesses popped up to capitalize on the crowds, and soon everything edible in the county was devoured. Coca-Cola bottles littered the ground. Devious con men would collect money to help with the rescue efforts. 2 jugglers turned up as entertainment. The more people that arrived, the larger the spectacle. But in that process, these hundreds of people forgot about the very man they were supposedly here to rescue. An unexpected form of entertainment was soon noticed. Old Man Lee. Lee Collins wandered around, speaking loudly of Floyd as if he was already dead, sometimes laughing. On Saturday, he passed out flyers for Crystal Cave, encouraging them to visit before they left. On Sunday, he'd run out of flyers. Instead, he sold small pictures of Floyd for $2 and told stories of Floyd's caving adventures, despite having looked down on Floyd's caving passions. Lee also refused to pose for photos unless he was paid. Quote, Red Cross representatives on Sunday night had trouble getting him to sign over contribution checks that had his name on them. There was a religious ceremony at 3:30 p.m., after which many people left, though this proved to be a team effort as many needed help getting out of the mud that had been churned up by hundreds of cars. Even with all these people having left, thousands clung to the 5-strand fence. Despite the fence being made of barbed wire and 100 yards from the rescue site, they were nearly always crowded with thousands of eyes, eager for entertainment. Having so many people present at the rescue site had many consequences, though not all immediately predictable. Sure, the land was littered and torn up, but it was the word of mouth that would actually become truly damaging. Come back next week to find out the conclusion and after effects of the Floyd Collins incident. After that, we'll discuss other strange sightings and encounters in Mammoth Cave National Park, as well as a few stories from witnesses. I'll see you then.